Great. Welcome back to OT Office Hours, everyone. If you are new here, this is not really a polished webinar. It's definitely not a sales pitch. It's us talking about the real things that we're seeing in the OT world. We cover a different topic each month, so make sure that you check back and register. Like I said, this is monthly ongoing. You can watch any of our past episodes on YouTube or on our website at insanecyber.com. I'm Sam Becker. I'm the head of marketing here at Insane Cyber. I'm going to be the moderator for today. Feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A as we go, and we'll work through them throughout the hour that we're here. So for today's conversation, we are looking at AI in OT. I think people have two reactions to AI. They either roll their eyes or they get super excited about it. And we are here to get you super excited about AI in OT. Talk about what's possible, what it can and can't do inside of industrial networks. So, joining me today are two people that I'm really excited to have in the room. We have Rob Bair from Anthropic, who brings kind of the frontier lab lens on what these models are actually good at and where they're falling over. And then Dan Gunter, who's the CEO and founder of Insane Cyber. He's going to bring that practitioner viewpoint from inside real plants and substations and his real experience that he's had in the field. Um, neither of them are doing the other's job. So that's exactly why this conversation is good. They're coming from two different viewpoints. So, with that, let's get into it, guys. Rob and Dan, do you want to share a little bit about yourselves a little bit more?
Yeah, Rob, I'll let you kick off with the intro and opening thoughts, and then I'll go from there.
Amazing. Well, as everyone knows, I work at a frontier AI lab, Anthropic. I can barely spell OT. Dan's the one who's spending his time inside of substations and pipelines and doing all the fun, real work. My background is spent 20 years in the U.S. Navy, mostly in and around the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command. Went to Splunk for a year and actually helped stand up their OT market group, where I learned how to spell it. And then did a couple years on the National Security Council and the Intel Directorate and the Cyber Directorate before I retired and went to into industry where I was at Team Cumry for a little while. I was the CISO in residence at Zscaler and now here at Anthropic, and super excited about this partnership with Insane Cyber and to talk about some of the things we're doing together.
Awesome. Yeah, and as Sam said, Dan Gunter, CEO and founder. What I'm excited today, we're going to try to keep, and again, we can't talk specifics around customers or sites or any of that, but what we can talk about is like, right, how to responsibly use, frontier models, how to, where possible, where to go local, how to, work through some of the challenges, right? These models have ways of thinking, and when you get into the OT space, what's key is like, right, the ethical side of it. How do you make sure that whether you're using a frontier model for something like an OT assessment or incident response or tabletop, how do you make sure that it both checks those ethical boxes and it thinks through OT environments in a predictable and high quality way that doesn't cause safety or other types of risks. So um, awesome.
Yeah, Dan, I love it. Like we've had so many good conversations going back and forth, as we figured out how we're going to layer frontier AI into OT, right? And so, as a frontier lab, we're building, general purpose reasoning models, not OT products. Like we don't get
Yeah.
down into the protocols and ports like you do. This model has no eyes, no ears, doesn't have hands inside the plant. It doesn't know the plant manager. It doesn't know you. You know the customers, but like, why do I care about this partnership? And I think like we as a frontier lab who prioritizes safety, first and foremost, physical safety, the risk, this is the highest consequence, like least defended corner of security. And like, there are a lot of limits to AI, right? And you as an OT practitioner know those better than anyone. Like, I would love to just kind of hear your thoughts on why this partnership is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, like getting into kind of the first key area, the problem space is different, right? When we get into the OT problem space, it is different from IT, right? And IT, like, right, oftentimes it's optimized for confidentiality, optimized for things like this. With OT, like, right, it's safety. You're potentially exposing to this, to analyzing things like, hey, how will a triconic safety system react? Or in our case lately, we've been working with some data from like mines and LNG sites and other areas. And when you're like, hey, go build a Claude enabled tabletop on this deal, like you have to kind of know like how is it like how is that frontier model thinking on that triconic safety system, right? Does it know about the protocols? Does it know, beyond kind of the TriSys report that we have, right? What actually is that coverage there, right? So, both when we get into OT, like our priorities are inverted, right? Because if it's not personnel safety, it's things like, hey, this refinery is moving benzene around or moving another deal, right? You also like, right, you have to watch because you can't just reboot a turbine or patch a controller, right? So even down to recommendations like, what comes out and what the norm is, sometimes you kind of have to help the model with that. A massive big area is protocols, right? And both the learning from the analysis side is frontier models, once they see the protocols, do a pretty good job of handling it. But sometimes you have to like, either lead it to look, right? We had a case where we dropped a PCAP in from a site. It was like, hey, this all looks like TCP. I was like, no, like it's potentially this type of historian traffic. It was able to go back through and be like, oh, wait, now I can pull historian tags. I can, with a little bit of context bump, right? That unknown protocol space, becomes a lot more open. Now, what I will say is you do get into fun into certain overloaded ports, like, right, you look at TCP 102 where S7com and MMS and some of the other protocols live. Sometimes it gets it wrong, right? And so that's where methodology, like you have to make sure it's not either hallucinating or assuming the wrong protocols there, because all the stuff down the road is going to be based off of that bad insight or bad um, opinion it made there. Where you can't see you drown. And so in that deal, like I think what I'm excited on the problem space too is it does get you to a wider space. There are things we've seen in Claude-enabled analysis and others that a human analyst would never see, right? When we look at things like OT assessment reports, right? What gets us excited is there are things you can do between like collection has to be an onsite, but once you get data and start putting it through, right? How much of that first 60 hours of analysis, can you take off the analyst plate to go deeper, right? And understanding that is what also makes that OT area kind of different. And then the analyst shortage is real, right? And this is the last point before we go over to Rob's view on why OT is its own planet, right? It's not a space on a hiring gap, right? We don't have enough people in the OT cybersecurity space that really understand this at this level, right? People may be really, really smart on the control system they've been around or what they've seen, right? But the fact is, if we're being honest in ourselves in a environment where they have 6 to 7 major control vendors, the analysts may only have visibility on one or two, right? And that's where, tuning a model, like going in, having that predictive thing can help with, not just the hiring shortage, but gap shortage. And I'm curious, Rob, what are your thoughts as I was talking through? How are you seeing the OT space from the frontier lab lens?
Well, I mean, the first thing that really struck me from what you said, Dan, was like data, right? And so why do I care as a frontier lab? Because we have this exploding data problem. You have only so many Dans in the world who can do this type of analysis. And like the mismatch between the data explosion and the talent shortage, like that's where, Claude and AI comes in and can really help. So if I'm able to get the data from you into our models and I can trust what comes back and have a human in the loop, like that is really, really powerful. I think, you know, Claude does not manufacture OT expertise from thin air, right? So you mentioned the analyst shortage. It's scaling those analysts and that expertise that already exists. I think we're surprised as we have these conversations how good at Claude is at some of this stuff just kind of natively, but it's never gonna replace an analyst. I think it takes one analyst and can make them into 100. And then, AI is really good at like reading volume, correlating, drafting, but those aren't the parts that are like really hard to get right in this space, as you know, Dan. Like knowing what normal looks like in a plant, that's what's really hard for the AI to get right, and that's where we have to have these experienced analysts in the loop, looking at the returns from Claude, but also, in the submarine, I used to be a submarine officer as well. In the nuclear world, we used to say like trust but verify, and so like we have to trust what Claude is telling us back potentially, and then really verify that data. But like, Dan, that's like brings me to a good question for you. Is like when you walk into a site that you've never put monitoring data on before, they've never had visibility, what do you usually find?
Yeah, it can depend on what the life stage of that cycle is. So we've been involved in M&A deals. I like M&A deals because oftentimes you walk in and sometimes the outgoing plant personnel are kind of like checked out, or they're like, who are these people buying us? Or we've been in one, and I remember from like the industrial network, like they were surfing like their 401k and internet, and it's like, oh man, are y'all like, there's a lot of recreational and other browsing, right? And so when you go in, and sometimes it's either never been monitored or you're early on, you'll find things like that. Um, the more sophisticated and crazy stuff that we'll find, even if it has been monitored, when you start to apply some of these models to it, is the depth that it goes to. To the historian tag mentions, I mean, we've had models that have, you know, pulled and extrapolated from historian and other tags in there. We've had ones be like, hey, I think this Modbus register, based on these Modbus reads and writes, I think it's functioning like this based on the context going around. And so there's always that level that's sometimes driven. If it's instant response, then stuff's kind of on fire. If it's the threat hunting side, like, right, then it can be harder, especially if you're looking for either a long dwell time adversary like we're seeing with some of the Volt Typhoon stuff or others, right? But um, what doesn't surprise me, I started my career with the Air Force CERT, and so I got to see a lot of what the IR cases that hit the Air Force back when I was at that time, like so it doesn't change. It's just like, hey, is this a sophisticated kind of blend in attack or is it not? And I think something to point out on the AI side is it's important for defenders to somewhat think through how they adopt it, right? Because like attackers are only going to get better with the tool. Something with Trisis and with Indestroy, with Ukraine 2016 attack, crash override, like there were bugs in that malware. Now with attackers using AI to generate, like we're going to like our detection engineering is going to have to step up because like these frontier models on the attack side are better at writing PyModBus code or using enip libraries. And so, what surprises me today is some of the depth, but like in the future, I think like how we think through how we deal with the speed of AI attack versus defense is going to be key.
Yeah, and maybe we can get into this later, but I think that like speed, which was one of the reasons why we didn't make generally available, Mythos preview
Yeah.
to folks. But I mean, that's separate topic than OT. But
Yeah.
I think in this space, people always assume that more data is better. Like so,
Yeah.
we sit on top of insane cyber's tools, and you're bringing across all this OT data
Yeah.
into our models. But like the thing about it is if we don't have that reasoning capability and that analyzed data is now a liability, like what are we missing, right? It's sitting there, no one's available to read it, people can't read it because they don't understand all those protocols and things that are happening on the OT side, because there are only so many analysts with that capability in your world. And so I
Mhm.
think that's where we can close the gap using Claude. And I think we'll get into this later, but the time, and Dan alluded to this, the time that it can take an advanced analyst
Mhm.
to do some of these investigations is like reduced by tenfold, maybe 100-fold in some cases. And Dan, I'll never forget, I asked you like when we did the first investigation and we had all this, you had real data, and I said, how long would that have taken your best analysts to do
Yeah.
this? And you said, my best analysts are all from national labs. If they could do this level of investigation, just because the number of tools and reasoning ability that Claude was able to have, it would take them like 120 hours. It took
Oh
Claude like
yeah.
10 minutes.
Absolutely. And we've seen engagements too to where like Claude has started like reverse engineering protocols and we would bump it along. And like you take something like protocol RE of a vendor proprietary protocol, like that's a like weeks to months kind of thing. And we've seen Claude like on engagement sometimes be like, oh wait, I have a spec for that protocol, or let me go pull it. Or we dropped it in the folder and it was like, wait, this is just this. And suddenly it generated out a working Lua dissector or whatever it needed. So it's I would say, yeah, the right data is big, right? But when you get it, that right data, it can react pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, another question for you, right, is like
Yeah,
we've been talking about OT security for, I don't know, as long as I've been in the cybersecurity space. We've, gone and we've
yeah,
seen Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Ice Cream Typhoon, whatever you name it.
mhm,
Um, and we seem to continue to just observe the
yeah,
problem, right? So, like, in your opinion, as a practitioner, like,
yeah.
why now? What's happening? Where's regulation going?
Mhm.
Like, why do we have to do this today?
Yeah, I think for one, and we hit it briefly, we'll save a little more of that later. The speed of attack versus the speed of defense is big, right? Another kind of big key part of it, is like, right, a lot of asset owners have distributed assets, right? We have asset owners with thousands of assets and 2 to 3 security people, right? And they can't put people, or hey, to get to that remote substation, it's a helicopter ride or a few hour kind of deal. And so we just have to deal with kind of that deal there. Um, I think the why now is both because we have and we will continue to have that gap. I think when it comes to regulation with AI, like when you can use frontier models, great, right? But I see a few folks from like NERC SIP regulated areas, right? There's times where it may have to be a model that's on a DGX park in a substation so you don't break your SIP compliance level. Like, and so the right model at the right place is kind of big. I think too, also the air gap is a myth, right? When you take something like NERC SIP, there still is a boundary. My favorite one is vendor maintenance highways. Most asset owners are either sold like, hey, this vendor maintenance highway is a one-way thing, it's totally not two-way. And then you pull a packet capture and you're like, wait, this is not at all a one-way kind of how you described it, right? And so the air gap largely is a myth outside of a lot of areas. You also don't need a 0 day, in that area, right? When you go into OT, right? If it's just a Modbus write or Ethernet IP right away, there's a certain nuclear breaker to where if you send a few packets of a certain protocol, it'll open up breakers in the nuke plant, right? That is written in the manual for that nuke plant. And
Crazy.
very few practitioners know on that, right? And so
Yeah.
when we think on a 0 day in that, like not only are these models getting better, but from that, like targeting another perspective, like it's only going to get kind of interesting there, right? And OT attacks, like right, still look like IT at first, right? So
Yeah.
you're going to see those early kill chains. Like in OT, you have to use both ICS and OT attack, but I'm curious, what sticks out from the frontier side? What are you thinking on this?
I mean, we're looking at the same types of things, right? Like regulation, coming from government. Now we've got, regulation that says, hey, internal network security monitoring
Yeah,
inside these like utility trust
yeah,
zones or anomaly detection and threat hunting, which you specialize in across whole portfolios. Like you can't go out and cover hundreds
yeah,
of remote substations with the number of analysts that you've got. So we need to have, AI augmented insane cyber like tools to go out there and automate because that's the only viable way that we're going to be able to do this. And I think, it's interesting that this capability, and not often this happens, but we're having
yeah,
this capability arrive with, us and your partnership arrive
mhm,
at the same time as this regulation. So like this is
yeah,
a really key opportunity for us to go and do this together. And then I think as a lab, the same frontier capabilities, this is what we've been talking about with like Mythos Preview, the
yeah,
same frontier capabilities that help defenders, they also lower the bar for attackers. So
yeah,
all of these ability to understand these, protocols that not
mhm,
many people in the world speak. Now I've just lowered the bar and allowed more people into this like attack thing. So you got faster reconnaissance, you got better coding, you've got better social engineering. Um, Defenders need to adopt this before attackers get open source models in their hands and really figure this out. And then I think finally, again, as we've seen from Mythos Preview, we've gone from this threshold where models are answering a question.
mhm,
Now they're taking many steps to call tools. This is like the agentic shift that we're seeing to
mhm,
MCP servers, long horizon reasoning, like Meter saying these things are going to double every 7 months. Pretty soon we're going to have a month long agentic process, which we may already have now in certain processes. So like
Mhm.
now we have autonomous investigation that is like
Yeah.
actually not, it's not even conceivable. It's real because you've built it. And so I think it's just going to move even faster.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting there too, from a practitioner level, what's really nice on using some of the AI enabled side is like, so we have skills for like threat hunting and OT tabletops and other things. And what's fun to the point on regulation too, is it's nice not being an expert of every single country out there and everyone's regulation frameworks to be like, hey, pick
Yeah.
your country that you're going to tomorrow and be like, okay, let me build a tabletop. And it doesn't require a whole upfront on like, okay, let me go learn country X and his entire regulatory stack for water or power. And so it's been an amazing tool there. But people are saying AI changes everything. What do you think has changed in the last 18 months that matters for OT?
Yeah, I think it's what I just mentioned, really, the
Yeah.
reliable tool usage, like the ability to call so many tools during an investigation using MCP servers. Like, we're all limited by what we can do as human analysts. And like, maybe I can call, you know, 5 tools in a whole day's work. But with our partnership, you could call hundreds of tools to do this investigation. And I think it's really also the longer horizon reasoning that these agents are able to do. So the model can now run this multi-step investigation with submodels and orchestrators and all the specialized tooling. You're not just like summarizing through a log file anymore and saying like, this is like a real investigation that turns out to be very accurate.
And Sam, I see we have a question, but before we hop in, a disclaimer that probably should be made that legal on both sides of this webinar should appreciate. When it comes to regulatory and building these, like both parties involved in this call, highly recommend human in the loop. Human in the loop is the way to go for OT, and like nothing we're recommending today shouldn't incorporate some version of human in the loop responsible usage. But Sam.
Yeah, that's a great point. No, I just want to pause you guys for a second. We've got some questions in that were kind of relevant to what you were asking about. So one of them, and I think you talked to this a little bit, but I think it's building on it. But how do you give context, data context to AI? So like at S4 earlier this year, they talked about having an enterprise namespace. Is that necessary to give the proper context to the data being fed into the AI? Or are there any good options to give context to that?
Yeah, Dan, I mean, I'll let you take this one, and I think we were going to kind of hit on this lightly earlier. I mean, this goes into really training, right? And that's where it gets scary. And going back to where Dan's point about keeping a human in the loop, it's like Claude will, or some of these LLMs, including Claude, will overconfidently answer things that it doesn't know about and doesn't have the context on that look like very solid answers. And so, Dan is providing the expertise and the insane cyber team is saying like, no, Claude, you're actually wrong here. I don't know how many times that you've seen it, but would love kind of your thoughts on how it's operating in the OT space.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to confidence, when it comes to like how you feed that data, and with that, so for one, especially, so there are ways, and we have approaches where it's like collected in a very sensitive space it can't leave, and then there's some amount of sanitization and getting rid of things that may not want to be pushed farther out. And then from that, having a frontier other model, right? And so what that's going to is sometimes when you're using frontier models and curriculum structure, right? The folks are like, wait, the curriculum structure side is rightfully entirely isolated, but we want to take advantage of this other thing. How we've kind of approached the problem is one, having skills that can sanitize and having things that can reasonably sanitize, and then again have a human that'll check to make sure like the data isn't leaking when it goes there. Once it goes out, then to Rob's point, it's even things like in your skills and as it's going through, like keeping a registry of how opinions or how decisions are made. Is this something I'm observing? Is this something I'm inferring? Is this something I'm assuming, right? And so with that, it keeps kind of the chain of custody of how it's thinking through. And you can go back at the end and be like, okay, if I observed it, even like what packet was that out of? Where can I actually go back and confirm that I did it, right? To where if it's inferring it, it's like, okay, is this inferring it because, the model's picking it up and being like, hey, the sector norm for mining or electric power thinks it should be this, right? Or for like a turbine or maintenance highway, I see there's another kind of question in there too. And so if it's like, hey, we're pushing this on a maintenance highway, right? It's that side of like, okay, let me, on our side, we'll educate it up to be like, hey, this is the normal thing you should kind of see here, but there are going to be inferences. And so to Rob's point, some of it is that side of keep that risk register. For us, we put the highest confidence on things we can point back to packets on. We put the next highest confidence on some of the inference that's backed by maybe an asset owner gave us like a P&ID, a piping and instrumentation diagram. Maybe they give a network map. Maybe we drew up a network map and we were like, hey, with that human in the loop, did the human confirm that it was there, right? That'll change some of that confidence level to say, hey, it's lower confidence without the human saying it's right. It's higher confidence once the human's like, okay, yeah, I'm confirming it's there. So we deal with it through like a multi-layered approach and try to keep that forensic layer. Rob, any thoughts on that? Does that make sense?
No, I mean, I think that tracks. And when we think about data, I mean, generally in frontier models, right? Like we treat data handling as a contractual and architectural question, not just like some vibe. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really responsible to have explicit consent, clear data use terms.
Mhm.
And then to your point about sensitive sites, it's like keeping the data inside the enclave entirely.
Mhm.
I think for us, people always ask, well, are you using my data to train your models? And the answer to that is no. I mean, that's like explicit in our terms of use that we're not going to use your data up front. But like that makes it difficult to give it context if we're not using that data as training data. And
Mhm.
like Dan, do we have other questions, Samantha? Sorry, I can't see the.
Yeah, no, there's one more that I just want to get to
Okay.
before we go on in kind of the agenda that we've got, but it's relevant to what you guys are asking. So,
Mhm.
recognizing that human context will almost always be needed in this initial time, will or could an agentic model be trained to make decisions when normal OT security baselines are established?
Dan, I'll let you take that one because we've had many conversations about like again trust but verify.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it depends on like what action is being looked at. It's funny. When we talk on AI, and when we work with folks, like the questions that come up are those questions. It's like, how's the AI being used, right? Is it just analysis and reporting in that generate or general side? Is it getting into more of the agentic side, or is it like putting something like a firewall rule block or something else out there? My opinion, I don't think like the agentic, I think eventually it'll move there, but I think there's a lot of science that has to be done. And I would be like, again, this is the opinion of Dan. I would like if someone's saying that they're doing like full agentic, no human in the loop blocks, like they definitely should check because they might also be breaking the terms and conditions with whoever their frontier provider is on certain things. And so like to me it goes to an ethical point of like absolutely do I think eventually agentic stuff will move in that direction? Yes. Is it there today? Probably not ethically in a way.
Yeah. I'll steal your thunder a little bit, Dan. Like you said this to me. You said, "Hey, we can't have a hallucination in an OT network, right?" It's
Yeah, yeah,
that's not like just assuming that
yeah.
I had a meeting yesterday that I didn't have. This is like a
Mhm.
real safety
Yeah,
risk that if you rely on an LLM and you have a
yeah,
hallucination, something could go offline, something
yeah,
could really bad could happen. And I think we have to right now keep humans in the loop because
yeah.
these models are not 100% reliable today. I mean, they're great, they're wonderful, but like, is 1% uh, getting it 1% wrong? Is that acceptable in an OT network? In many cases, I would say no.
And I think like we have to be realistic to OT buyers, right? So I was out at a mine in a past life, right? And we were walking through parts of the mine for an assessment, and for the assessment, like, right, we see the password and username for the console on one of the PCs, and we're like, hey, like, what's going on here? And they were like, if we don't quickly have the password and if we can't quickly step in, like, here are all the bad things that are going to happen in this part of the mine, right? And I think like to go fully agentic in OT, it's going to have to require both the computer science side that cybersecurity lives on and the like actual physical process side that the chemical and mechanical and electrical and every other type of engineer is comfortable with. Because the minute you lock that engineer out, and it causes it, like it's that's a that's an unrecoverable and worst day for any tech, right?
Yeah, we're then in a HAL 9000 world then. But like talking about the I guess I will call it the internal issues with using AI and agents and other things in OT. Like, let's go like externally. Do you
Yeah.
think that the threat is genuinely worse, or are we just seeing more because like visibility is improving in these systems because we have people like you out there?
Candidly, I think it's a mix of the two. And to start with the darker day one, before we had the advantage of attackers not understanding proprietary protocols, right? Like pulling off Trisis, pulling off a Triconics attack, where you pull a like proprietary Schneider Electric protocol to a safety system and actually get onto that safety system. In the past, that's been the level of like nation state capable attackers that candidly, on that one, if you go to DOJ indictments, it was a national lab of another country that kind of worked on that capability, right? I think like where that gap does tighten to where you start to have like opportunistic groups, ransomware groups, other groups out there work in this space is that the model lowers that bar from a national
Yeah.
lab level to a lower understanding, right? Um, Granted, the frontier models are putting a lot of safeguards in, prompt protections, other safeguards that the frontier models are doing, right? But there's always going to be some model out there, some approach, or even the local one to work around, right? And so I think absolutely it does change that from that level. From the defensive side, though, it does also help us if we go in, right? That same thing that can help with how do I deal with this proprietary protocol for this type of asset? Like, again, that's where like some of the adoption of it actually helps the defender side, right? Because you don't on the defense side want to be kind of left out there, right? I
Yeah.
think big for here is like when you look at like Bolt Typhoon and some of that level, like right, that state actor pre-positioning is measured in a number of years. Adversaries are getting quieter there, right? So um,
Yeah. I mean, that threat landscape, you brought up Volt Typhoon. I was still in government when we saw that happening, and kind of still, in my mind, I think slow to respond to this critical infrastructure visibility and pre-positioning. But like, let's talk a little bit about what AI is changing, right? And so, as a model provider, um, we're providing something that a model is genuinely good at, that we can't scale enough people, right? And so a model is good at multi-step reasoning, right? It's working across many tools, compressing like big volumes of data into like a narrative within minutes. And so I think we've seen this shift since like GPT 3.5, whatever it was, that's just a chatbot, to now this like agent that's now investigating, and you can go and let them loose on real data. Now, an analyst can take a corpus of data that, and I brought up, and these are your figures, but 40 to 120 hours down to produce a structured pass of that analysis in a few minutes, right? And so that gives you speed, but that also gives you the ability to cover much more ground and much more infrastructure. It's not the final answer. It's not the end all be all, because to your point earlier, we want to still keep the human in the loop in OT. But Claude is now like a reasoning engine, right? It needs data brought to it, which is where you come in. We don't deploy or we don't deploy Claude in OT systems, and it needs trustworthy tools, things that you're familiar with in the OT space, to like act through and on, right? On its own, Claude is just an analyst, locked outside of an evidence room somewhere. Like, we need to bring Claude into the evidence room to give it the ability to look at all those protocols and the data that you talked about. So that's the most important part, Dan, like how we bring the data into Claude. And that's where insane cyber comes in.
Absolutely. And then for us, like what's key here, what we've learned in R&D settings, what we've worked through is like how you build those skills, how you build out, whether it's again a tabletop or OT assessment or whatever part of like, OT engagement you're trying to build in. Um, the process you take does absolutely matter. I mean, when we're going from iteration to iteration, we're measuring from the let me drop this PCAP in and just see what Claude thinks on its own. And we'll actually have it and narrate the process and see things. And it's funny, through that narration, we pick up things like, okay, like, it's acting as a junior analyst in this way, it's missing this. And, what's funny today that we've noticed is we're like, okay, it consistently makes these mistakes, or hey, it consistently goes there, right? When we're working through iterations of the different reports, it's then like, okay, hey, what does it look like when we expose our tool via MCP, when we start pumping in other contexts, right? When we give it that ability to see more. Candidly, what we see in there is it starts to get into tags. We've had cases where ladder logic rungs have been pulled off of the wire, ladder logic being the what drives the PLC, what drives other things. And then it mark it up and actually put it in context of other data, right? So what we see here specifically is and we wrote a longer write-up on it yesterday that we published out on LinkedIn. But with that, like in OT, like the model is great. The approach and how you tell it and how you lead it along, making sure it doesn't get ahead of itself and start inferring things before it goes through certain amounts of analysis. Again, there are things in OT assessments you want to make sure like it fully completes analysis on steps of a tabletop or others and then goes into inference. Because if that inference kicks off sooner, that's where you start to get hallucinations and where like it just compounds, right? Um, things that surprise us in there, like the depth that it goes to. It's found like crazy parts of sites we would never, even go to. It's found context. So we even in one mine it found systems we didn't even know were there, and talking to others they didn't, right? And so what's really cool from it is both from a like asset discovery from that level, especially if it's able to go back into the agentic question earlier, if you start to make those scripts agentic and it can kind of iterate on those iterations and go through, it's super valuable. And then last one I'll say on there is just the synthesis of operational data and cybersecurity data. And so what's really neat is with the volume of data going in. So like traditionally, like right on the cybersecurity side, we focused on things like, hey, let's get to the protocol, let's get to the function code, and maybe we get to a register address. When you start feeding into and being like, okay, what is the context of that register? Hey, for some PLCs, the registers are in the manuals and known, right? Others, you have to have the ladder logic or other deal to go there. But when you're using these tools in OT, yes, it does potentially introduce some ability to hallucinate, but you start to get like operational insights with cyber. And we're seeing asset owners get super excited on, kind of the promise on that. So, um,
I love it. I love it. Like, so I guess kind of two questions for you. The first one should be like an easy one. Like, would you agree with the statement that, AI is providing augmentation math, not replacement math? And like what I mean by that is, the leverage is an AI instead of an analyst. And we talked
yeah,
about keeping the human in the loop time and time again.
yep,
It's AI does like 80% of the synthesis and the grunt work and the stuff that only Dan and a few other people
yeah.
in the world at Latin National Labs can do. And then the expert spends like an hour judging the AI's work and then talking to the customer or having conversations with leadership in the lab.
Yeah, absolutely. It's things from everything. Like if I'm dealing with again a triconic safety system or a Yokogawa MVP kind of network out in a refinery, right? For one, where the augmentation, it's 100% augmentation there, like right. It allows that analyst to cover more, but it does at least give an opinion. especially as you start bringing in manuals, as you bring in other things, as you introduce other data, it can shorten that call to where you may still call one of those OEMs to ask that question like, hey, is this how it actually works here? But when we get into confidence levels and tagging data, when we're like making process inferences, it automatically gets tagged to a level that's like, hey, this should go to someone with a professional engineering degree, right? I'm not comfortable saying like this thing's going to blow up or it's going to do this, right? Because like the model may see that and where that chain of custody and where that interpretation is big. And again, to that ethics side is big is you have to have that deal, right? Because it is augmentation, but that flagging up of like, hey, you should really take this to a PE or someone in the plant's huge. But scaling absolutely is massive.
Incredible, incredible. And like you've had, I don't know, I wouldn't say quite some time because you moved really rapidly when you started integrating Claude into Insane Cyber. But like, what did the agent do that like really surprised you or caught you off guard, either good or bad?
I would say again, those insights, there were a few days ago, we were working through a protocol or working through a PCAP. And again, it was just with the PCAP, it was just kicking out dissectors at a point, and it wasn't entirely right. Like there were times we were iterating on that human in the loop, and because you can be like, what was interesting with that data set is it started with a PCAP, and it was like, hey, here's a PCAP. I'm pretty sure like this asset is this. Go find it, and it found a certain OEM. It started trying to tear it apart. It kind of hit a blocking point, and then it was like, hey, like you know this would help or this is where I'm at. It was like, hey, if you can find this manual, it would kind of go to that next point, right? And so for us, when it goes into things like protocol RE, when it goes into other areas, that's where we're seeing like just super crazy awesome things.
Love it. It is surprising, when I get a message from you and you're like, I can't believe that
Yeah, yeah,
the model is
yeah,
able to do this without any, like, we didn't train the model to do
yeah,
that.
yeah,
And I think,
yeah,
that leads us back to this whole training thing. The model still does, like,
yeah,
it falls on its face, right? Whenever you leave it run unsupervised in some ways, because like if it doesn't have context or something is novel or anything that needs ground truth about like a previous normal that
yep,
the model was never given, this is
yeah,
where like you run into like it will just give you like overconfidence,
yeah,
under uncertainty, right? And so
yep,
this is not just our model, this is how
yeah.
frontier or LLMs work. I think the other question that, like, having been at Splunk, and I think the other question that I get from people, like, aren't you guys just building like a fancy sim correlation role? Like, what's the differentiator here, Dan?
I think, when you get into some of the inferences, the insights, like where we see folks struggle in the OT space and going back to like limited teams is like everyone is overrun with alerts, right? And so, pick your platform, pick how it's implemented, right? And where this is significantly and where we've seen significant promise on it, right, is both how it explains it in plain language, but also like how it reasons across those domains, right? So working through that, that's where we've seen it, kind of significantly lower and go beyond just, hey, let me throw a flag up and then require an analyst, to dig through it a bunch. Um,
Yeah, Dan, I think you should. There's a question in the chat here about giving Anthropic
yeah,
Yeah.
OT
yeah,
data
yeah,
from customers.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think like we should really go down that path.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
great question. So a question that we received through was, will Insane Cyber give Anthropic, data from its customers or other data? So absolutely not. Every engagement, every relationship we have with our customers, it's negotiated through on if the customer does or doesn't want to do it. We have customers where it starts really hard, where they're like, do not share any, and we're like, okay, great. Like we will just not, you know we will not use it for that. We don't need for that. We'll make sure it lives in a place that doesn't kind of get exposed out, right? For our customers that are interested in kind of being part of that R&D or other scale, that's when we can start to apply different layers of data handling. And so it's things like, okay, is this, NERC SIP regulated data? Is this other types? Is there something here? do you want to default not share, but you're all right sharing this one little part of it, right? And so, but by default, we are actually a not share, and that gets negotiated through with every data processing agreement, statement of work, or whatever it is, you know, on either side. Rob, do y'all have any view on that? I know that that was an insane cyber question on our side, but any insight
Yeah,
from the Anthropic side?
we actually don't train on customer data either,
Yeah.
and so like I think it would be both in our terms of service. But like I think data acquisition is a good thing to go and talk about now. And I see another question pop in, and we'll come back to that. But
Yep.
data acquisition is so important because people are like, well, you're at Anthropic, you're at this massive company, you have this crazy growing revenue, you must have so many people. We don't have a lot of people. Like, why don't you just build this yourself, right? And so and then I've gotten this question from a forum partner in ally. They're like, can't you just like throw Claude at our critical infrastructure? I'm like, we don't have any sensors, right? We don't have any presence inside OT networks. We don't have any packets. We don't have any host telemetry. We don't have any protocol visibility, right? Like, we're only able to reason on the data that's brought to it, right? And so without a collection and delivery layer, this is, OT is, our ability is capped at like whatever a human can paste into, a prompt, right? This is the single biggest reason like we at Anthropic need a partner like Insane Cyber. I think the second thing is going back to training data again is, this is real OT traffic. This is Modbus from a compressor station, DNP3, SIP in an auto plant, right? This isn't like a public corpus of models that we would just have access to that we could do training and learn from. And so, you know, raw captures in the wild, completely useless without an expert, labeling them, and which is why we need a partner like Insane. And then I think telling a legit operational action from, something an adversary would command. And again, Dan, going back to what you've told me in the past, you're like, these things are just dumb. They just do the command that you tell it to do. Like, that's practitioner judgment. And then I think, there's also this like long tail of proprietary undocumented protocols that don't have any specs that like we would never have access to, where we need your help. I think, again, going back to this, I think it's so important. Hallucination in IT. This is a safety risk, not like an inconvenience. And so, most enterprise settings in IT, a wrong answer, it's okay. But in enterprise OT settings, it usually gets caught by some sort of human review or a human in the loop. And this could, if we have a false positive, this could generate like an unnecessary shutdown, or generate or result in a real operational or financial cost. And I think the last thing is, frontier models can't reach the places that matter most, right? So the most urgent OT, you brought up classified facilities, forward deployed military, offshore platforms, remote sites. Like, it's often air gapped or disconnected. A cloud only model is going to be architecturally excluded from these sites. And so reaching these environments, we need purpose built deployable hardware and offline workloads that Insane Cyber builds, that we will never build at, well, we have no plans to build at Anthropic. I say, like, never say never. But yeah, I think you're just such an important partner here, Dan, that like we're lucky to have
Yeah.
you.
And we have levels, go to the practitioner side. We have levels we architect up to some of the questions on how much gets shared up. And so as we architect, so we have an MCP binding in our product. And so Claude actually by default does not actually have access to any of the raw PCAP or other data. When you run like our OT assessment report, it does MCP calls that actually hit process data on our platform. And so by default, there's things our engineering team did that's like, you can go into the full agentic mode that'll be like, hey, reach back into the PCAP, let Claude like start pulling bits and bytes and packets, or go into Windows event logs and pull things that maybe the MCP won't expose. For a user that's less concerned on data sharing, it is like you do get slightly better insights. For one that's just like, hey, I don't want Like I want insane cyber in between, and I don't want Claude to see the raw data. What's important, whether it's us or others, is to know how that's architected because from a data sharing perspective, it's two different things. For us, by default, if you don't click that analyze with packet data, Claude only sees IP addresses and ports and like traffic that it sees and like thread hits and other things going through. If you do hit this, kind of, hey, use the PCAP, then the agentic side, like it will actually go through and be like, okay, what bits and bytes, and let me reason through, right? And so, because discipline does beat that autonomy there, right? And so it's really important to weigh, and especially on this, like, right? On information sharing versus full autonomy are somewhat at odds when it comes to this level, right?
Yep.
But the solution lives in the middle of the spectrum, and the human has to stay accountable, right? So, I guess, Rob, like asset owners hear AI and see a black box making decisions on their plant, like, how do you answer that fear? Like, what?
God. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd start by agreeing with them, right?
Yeah.
I think like the right architecture and the right design working with you, it keeps the model away from like raw control decisions. It constrains it to validated tools and tool calls through MCP. And again, we're going to come back to this. It keeps the human in the loop, right?
Mhm.
I think skepticism and fear are valid about the wrong architecture and the wrong way of putting these tools into place. Um, the model gets it wrong sometimes, Dan. Like if a
Yeah.
model hands you something as an operator and it's very confident about a finding, what's insane's process to like
Mhm.
adjudicate that data and then
Yeah.
do the right thing?
Yep. We've had cases, and a good example there is again, it goes back to process, that point of making sure parts of inference don't start before parts of analysis. Like when you're doing an asset inventory, you want to do the asset inventory and then infer on it. Then you want to do crown jewels analysis and things, and then kick off that side, right? And if you start crown jewels before you do that others, like, right, you get into that black box side, or if the tool doesn't actually like, so if it doesn't follow a process, if it doesn't have provenance on that data going through, it's really hard to catch it out going out the door. And then at the end of the skill, at the end of the AI capabilities, something we have it do a lot is try to do a retrospective pass. So for our OT assessment approach, it is like a 11 to 15 gate process for running OT assessments. Some you would expect from a like on-site person, like, hey, do a site walk down, get data. But some of it is also that side of just checking those assumptions. And a hard thing, like something to know on OT is if you take data from like the powerhouse of a mine and you just drop it into Claude and say generate a tabletop, it may say like, hey, this looks like a power substation because I see SEL and I see outstations and DMP3. And without those kind of checks and gates and things, like upfront, you want to say like, no, this is actually from a mine environment. It's important to know, because otherwise, like it'll just run through and think it's, open power grid.
Well, I mean, I guess the obvious question is then, Dan, like, why can't I just go and take an LLM and just hook it up to my historian and just run with it?
It is that side, like, right again, and I think we've hit on it here. It's the predictability of what comes out is big. Like, if you don't actually know the process is following, if you don't have that chain of custody on decisions being made and going through, right? If you can't audit through those results, then you're kind of vibe coding the entire engagement, which is going to lead to kind of vibe code outcomes, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about vibe coding a bit and bringing us back to human in the loop, which is really kind of workforce and trust and vibe coding. Like Dan, what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
like why do we need to keep the human in the loop? I think we've hit on it many times
yeah,
today, but just like let's talk
yep,
about
yeah.
judgment, trust, all those things.
Yeah, and I'll jump through because I know we're hitting time and I know we have a bunch of questions we can kind of hit, right? And so like from the OT practitioner lens, like, right, the job does come towards judgment, right? If Claude is helping with that first 80%, you really do want that analyst to go through, and really validate, challenge, drop the report back through, work through there, right? Trust is earned through there, right? So bolting AI onto live processes isn't going to go well, like, right? It's not going to lead to a high trust outcome, and it's not going to work well there. Um, if you like AI only amplifies the issue, right? So if we look at something like Reach, Reach is that real prize for understaffed teams, but if the AI is not performing at a single site, you're just going to have garbage, across all of those sites, right? And so when we think like trust and human in the loop, all of that, like without that human in the loop validating, it's not going to turn out well generally.
Yeah. I know we only have 3 minutes left and we can go through a couple more things, but I would like to get to Todd's question really quickly first. Yeah, Todd, um, sometimes it is hard for small vendors to get the resources they need from a large frontier company. And I'd say a partnership with someone like Insane is probably the best way to go about getting Claude enabled OT capabilities with ZDR because we have all that through our partnership, and we can just verify that for you. And then Dan, like last question before we go back to questions is like 5 years from now, like where do you see an OT analyst? Like where do you see their role? Does it shrink? Does it grow? Does it change?
Look, I think like AI and the layer is going to help practitioners come into the field. I think like the folks that are technically minded and smart, it's going to help spin up the junior analysts a lot quicker. So I'm not on the view that this is going to entirely replace the junior analyst workflow for OT security. It's going to, I think, help the junior analyst spin up faster and at least be able to reason through, right? In 5 years, I think it'll change some of like what we do as OT security professionals from like where we spend our time. And so like, right, a lot of time is spent in that front part of an engagement. And if I can use a tool like this to open up time to deliver like higher quality reports in shorter amounts of time, right? If I can free up, if I have a process and a set of eyes going through, I think like it's going to grow the capability of analysts. There are going to be probably some folks that it does push out in that point, but I think it'll scale out that side of just coverage and reach. How about for you? I mean, what should a mid-career OT person learn to stay ahead of this?
I mean, I think it's learning how to work with agents, right? And learning how to use these frontier models, to frame your investigation, and to go through your evidence chain, and really, again, we'll come back to this time and time again. It's spotting the confident but wrong answer that AI may be giving you, so you don't make a mistake in the plant. And so it's really supervision skills, not like prompting skills.
Mhm. Absolutely. And the earlier question that he was referring to was on zero data retention contracts. And so there's a few ways you can work around that. Definitely, we can follow up too on some of that with a few different approaches on that. But Sam, I know we're right at time. Do we want to do a question or
Yeah,
two?
let's do a couple questions, just because some of them have been sitting here. So, one question is kind of around like a deployment model on where is it most effective to place AI? Like, is it on like turbine monitoring specifically? Is
Mhm.
it at each site? Is it more effective to have all things feeding up to one kind of central, like if you look at our fleet, for instance, like is it does it make sense to have like AI enabled on our fleet manager and then the others are just kind of dumb or like not
Yeah.
AI enabled, you know?
I'll take a first stab on this because to the agentic side into the hey, when is this ready to turn into full Skynet running it? On one thing, like some of that fundamental research on where you place it, AI is only as smart as the data it gets, right? And so if you only put it on part of the plant network, it's only going to have the concept of that part of the plant network. If you go to like a Honeywell Experion refinery and you have 16 Honeywell Experion communities that are their domains, it may only know about the hydrocracker or the electric or other yard, right? And so, what's key to sensor placement on this is also being somewhat aware while it's inferring things and while it's going through, like what data is it operating on? When it comes to turbine networks and plant data highways, when it comes to G, right? which part of the question was around, right? You have the plant data highway, the unit data highway, and the Atlanta data highway, right? Like going off of that risk profile, understanding like, okay, where are those key points that go out and in, right? How does it align to threat? And, where do I need to go for the right of inference to be made, right? Because again, the data coming out is only going to be as good going in. Some of where we test on our skills is exactly that. Grab PCAP or grab data from a part of the environment and see what opinions it comes to only knowing a fraction of that environment, right? Rob, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, Dan, I think it all goes back into getting visibility into your blind spots first, right? Like that's why it's so important to get the network tapped and monitored. And like we can't reason with AI over data that we don't have. And
Yeah,
so like I think that's step one, and keep the human in the loop, right?
absolutely.
Yeah, I think, and I think to that point too, that's kind of a question of scale too, right? How do utilities or entities that have kind of those smaller budgets um, get access to that? The next question is more of kind of a lab-based question, but have you seen any experimentation pitching AI offensive agents against a target that's being protected by AI defensive agents? And would the defense generally have the advantage?
Um, we have been surprised by this. So we have what's called the Frontier Red Team at Anthropic, and I'll let Dan answer it on the OT side. But early indications are that the offensive side has the advantage first, but then the defender will realize, well, I shouldn't have opened that spear phishing email. I need to look more closely at the content of this PDF that I opened that, generated a malicious script. And so we're seeing this like uplift in defensive capabilities that we think we can, I guess democratize is the right word, in the future to make the defender actually take those steps initially rather than have to learn the hard way.
Mhm. And I would say too, like the access to it and like what you put in the data to train on for OT. Like we talk about protocols and we talk about getting ahead and dual uses and ways both sides can use, right? It's one thing to or to train a frontier model, or sorry, it's one thing to develop a PCAP or develop a dissector, develop a protocol dissector off of a frontier model or local model. When you give it a PCAP, it's a different one when you start to give it like a DLL. It's like I know the protocol's in here and I can go through openly, like where some of these frontier models are performing really well too, is being able to pull out proprietary protocols and get to things quickly. And that's where like that greatly helps the attacker. And if the defender, it can help that speed if they don't have visibility on that specific protocol or tool. So absolutely.
Yeah, that wraps up the questions. Thank you guys for joining. Rob, thank you so much for this. This was a great conversation, and Dan, always a pleasure to talk to you in office hours, obviously. But man, it feels like we should have a second because I know there was more stuff we wanted to talk through that we didn't get to. So, Rob, come back anytime. And yeah, thank you again for joining. Like I said, next month we'll have Joe Slowick on talking about threat hunting. So be sure to register for that, and we'll have the recording out for this in the next couple of days or so. So, yeah, again, thank you guys so much for your
Thanks,
time,
everyone.
and thanks for the great discussion. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.